Greetings. Today I want to continue on my discussion of the late Nietzsche. In particular, I want to extend my claim that Nietzsche did not die of syphilis. I've said it before in one of the earlier lectures on Nietzsche, but I haven't given evidence or argument for that, and today I would like to do just that. It's an important point because those who think that he did die of syphilis use that argument to often marginalize or cast into severe doubt everything really that comes after, and including Zarathustra, but particularly the late works of 1888. These are regarded as essentially unreadable or worthless because he was already, as they want to think, deep into his collapse. Now, I said basically that I think is absolutely untrue, that his works at the end are completely coherent until we get to really the last of them, which is Ecce Homo. But mostly they are sustained arguments, that the prose is sustainedly brilliant. Twilight of the Idols and the Antichrist are really well argued pieces. And in fact, the Antichrist is probably his most sustained piece of an intellectual contribution. It's one subject, many sections on that subject, but they all accumulate to the conclusion that he's going for. So he's not losing his touch towards the end in 1888, except when we come perhaps to Ecce Homo. And that is an arguable case. But before that, when we're in the Antichrist, Twilight of the Idols, these are not distinguishable from the earlier works that he had given previously, Gay Science, Zarathustra. They're all coherently articulated. So it doesn't seem plausible it doesn't seem reasonable to dismiss these later works. And I've tried to reinstate them in the interpretation of Nietzsche because I think these last works show his refined thoughts on these issues, which have been accumulating over the years, over the period in which he's been thinking about these things. They crystallize many things that are there earlier, but in a very nascent state, an uncrystallized state. So the question is then, what did happen to Nietzsche? And that's the puzzle of, that lingers over him. What on earth happened to Nietzsche in very early 1889, around about January the 3rd, maybe January the 2nd? What happened to him? We know the mythology of this. By the way, that's essentially roughly less than a week away in anniversary terms from my recording today. What happened to him? So one story is that, you can ignore all of the earlier works because there was already this incipient syphilitic damage that was running its course from early 1888 onwards. But then it sort of came to a head in beginning of 1892. Sorry, what am I talking about? 1889, sorry. The beginning of 1889. That was when he went out into the street and he embraced a horse that was being flogged by its owner, and he embraced the horse around the neck in order to stop the man from beating the horse. And then he seized up and he collapsed. And it said the owner of the hotel boarding house where he was staying came out and found him unconscious in the street and brought him back to the hotel. That is supposed to be the beginning. So on one version you have a long period of gestation for this disease, enough to ignore the earlier works of 1888. And then there is the view that it was a sudden onset. It was a collapse, an onset, and it was from that point onwards that he was raving mad. That's the alternative view. Neither of these views are true. The evidence is that early in 1888 he was still well in his right mind and working very conscientiously and articulately. He wrote 5 books in 1888, and they are substantial works. But from 1889 onwards, he was seriously incapacitated. Earlier in December of 1888, he had shown signs just after he had finished and sent to the printer, Ecce Homo, which is this book. After he had finished it, and it's very thin as you can see, after he had finished it and sent it to the printers, he then requested it back continuously for revisions. He was adding things and taking things away. Couldn't make up his mind on them. He did roughly the same thing for the Antichrist. The printer was, these things were privately printed, so he was paying for the printing. He couldn't make up his mind on what he wanted to conclude, and the poor printer had to basically stop what he was doing every time he got a telegram or a letter, and had to revise what he had done thus far. So it was difficult for him, but the continual changes of mind were an astonishing lack of decision in Nietzsche, which had come really to the fore in that period. So at the conclusion of Ecce Homo, we can say that already by that point, he had succumbed to something. You can already see this, and people are often put off by this, but I'll read them. You can see this in the chapter titles of Ecce Homo. It says, the second chapter is Why I Am So Wise. Third chapter, Why I Am So Clever. Fourth chapter, Why I Write Such Good Books. And then he goes through the books that he has written and concludes with the final chapter, Why I Am a Destiny, where he says, I am dynamite. Now, by the time you get to that final chapter, okay, you can say something has already beset him. He is already not, perhaps, in his right mind. But the interesting thing about this is that even though the chapter titles are manic and grandiose and absurd, perhaps, not perhaps untrue, but sort of immodest to an extreme degree, the chapters themselves are very interesting, and what he says about himself is not quite so grandiose as you're led to believe by the chapter headings. So even then, it's a mixed bag of things, and it's not what the people who dismiss this work would have you believe. If you actually read the work, it is more interesting and sustained than perhaps you might be led to believe by the chapter headings. So what then happened? And it happened before his collapse with the horse. It was there already in November, December of 1888. To get a flavour of this, I'll read you some quotes from postcards that he sent out preliminary to Christmas, when he was giving thought to his friends and when he came upon the need to reconnect with his family and his friends, and he did so in a very odd way. Here is a flavor of that, and from this I think you can see that the weird grandiosity that is in Ecce Homo was even more in force in these postcards that are December of 1888. So, and it's particularly sort of notable in the way he signs these things. Now, one can say, and I think with some justification, that perhaps all of this is meant as a joke. It's a joke to his friends, and that's possible. He had a sense of humor, and it's possible when he is saying some of these things that he is not intending them seriously. One has to bear that in mind. A mean-minded, unhumorous person might think, well, he's clearly lost it here, but not necessarily. Not necessarily. He may be just having fun. And certainly that's how he thought of himself, as having fun in this period. Laughing, couldn't stop smiling if he was walking in the street, perhaps making faces that sort of surprised passers-by. He thought of himself as having fun. Perhaps if one were to be a passerby, one wouldn't necessarily accept that as an excuse. But here's what he said. Here's what he said to Karl Fuchs. The world will be standing on its head for the next few years, since the old God has abdicated. I shall rule the world from now on. To Franz Overbeck, he said, Dear friend, in 2 months I shall be the foremost name on earth. Next one, and this is also to Franz Overbeck. I myself am working on a memorandum for the courts of Europe. I mean to sew up the Reich in an iron shirt and to provoke it to a war of desperation. I shall not have my hands free until I have the young emperor and all his appurtenances in my hands. Between ourselves, very much between ourselves, complete calm of soul, 10 hours of uninterrupted sleep. My sister, this is to Elizabeth, my sister, I am compelled to part company with you forever. This was not to be the case. She would look after him and make use of his name and his fame for many years to come. Anyway, my sister, I am compelled to part company with you forever. Now that my destiny is certain, I feel every word of yours with tenfold sharpness. You have not the remotest conception of what it means to be most closely related to the man and to the destiny in whom the question of millennia has been decided. I hold quite literally the future of mankind in the palm of my hand. To Peter Gast, he says, Sing me a new song. The world is transfigured and all the heavens rejoice. Signed, The Crucified. To George Brandis, he said, Once you discovered me. It was no great feat to find me. The difficulty now is to lose me. Signed, The Crucified. To Jacob Burckhardt, the famous historian, he said, I condone my boredom at having created a world. You are our greatest teacher, for I, with Ariadne, have only to be the golden balance of all things. Signed, Dionysus. Who is Ariadne? Ariadne was Cosima von Wagner, Wagner's ex-wife. It does look as though what we have here, confessed really, is his deep and abiding love for Cosima Wagner, which may explain much of the vitriol that he directed at Wagner in his last years. At the end of his letter to Jacob Burckhardt, a short while later, as a longer letter, not a card, he says, "I am God. I have created this parody. Tomorrow my son Umberto is coming with the charming Margarita, whom I receive, however, here too in my shirt sleeves." Of course, he had no son. "The rest is for Frau Cosima, Ariadne. From time to time we practice magic. I have had Caiaphas, the Jewish high priest, who condoned the I have had Caiaphas, who was the Jewish high priest who condemned Jesus, put in chains. I too was crucified at great length last year by the German doctors. Wilhelm, Bismarck, and all the anti-Semites done away with. You can make use of this letter, which does not make the people of Basel, in any way, which does not make the people of Basel think less highly of me." Overbeck received a letter saying, signed Dionysus, saying, "I am just having all anti-Semites shot." So, that is the end, middle of December roughly, 1888 to early January after his collapse. The tone of those is quite similar, in fact I would say the same really. There's not a marked degradation after the horse episode on January the 3rd. So, what are we to make of it? Is that syphilis or is it something else? Well, that's the subject that I want to get into today. The diagnosis of syphilis was not based on very much. It was in Nietzsche's notes from when he was 23. He was sent to a whorehouse by a doctor, and he came to the doctor with a swollen eye, which the doctor then looked at him and claimed that he had second degree syphilis. He wasn't really subsequently re-examined for this. It was noted that he had some sort of pockmarks on his genitals when he was admitted to the Jena hospital. But the diagnosis of syphilis was not really supported at that point. What I'm going to say is perhaps going to be a bit upsetting, but syphilis is a very, very disfiguring disease, and it doesn't fit the way in which it develops doesn't fit anything really in Nietzsche's progression. Which is marked by certainly periods of sort of a high degree of sexuality, particularly with Frau Cosima von Wagner, who was the widow. He calls her Ariadne because of the mythology that when Ariadne was left by Theseus on the island of Naxos, she was bereft of her lover, and Dionysus saw this and came upon her and made love to her. He was the son of Zeus, so his amorousness was part of his inheritance, as it were. The amorousness was reflected in poems that he wrote about her, to her, and it is a sort of a violent taking of her, in a sense, by force. And that is part of the mythology. That's why he calls himself Dionysus, and it's why he calls her Ariadne. She is to be his new bride, living on Naxos with him. That continues on as part of his mythology in the early years of his disease, when he's sort of collapsed and has been entered into 2 mental hospitals and then is taken out of them. Now what his state was then is violent and overtaken with these fantasies, overtaken with howls and screams and shouts and all the sort of the violent symptoms that one can imagine. But the ravages of syphilis do not appear. Even when he was then thought to be in a tertiary stage of syphilis, that is a final stage, there was no marks on him. Now, as I've said, syphilis is a very marking disease in its final stages. And those final stages are so marking that sufferers don't often last long. Only as long, really, at the longest, as 5 years. Nietzsche did not last only 5 years. He lasted 10 years, and none of these symptoms appeared for him. So there would be extreme marking of the face. In fact, the nose would be eaten away so that there was nothing left other than a hole in the face where the nose had been. The face was extremely marked and, well, let's face it, it was rather hideous. Now, I'm going to give you some pictures here. It's possible that YouTube will object and will take this entire video down. If they do that, then I will edit this video and put them into my paper on Nietzsche's last works, which is in the notes. It's called Nietzsche's Neolithic Metaphysics. So those marks are severe. They are horrific, really. But they don't appear on Nietzsche at all, at any point. There was no autopsy once he died in 1900, mid-1900. There was no autopsy done on him to verify in any way the diagnosis of syphilis. And by the way, there was no test for syphilis, a definitive test in those days at all. It was entirely the observational work of a doctor who could easily mistake certain symptoms for something else. There was nothing definitive about the early diagnosis of syphilis that had been made on him, or the acceptance of that diagnosis by the doctor in the first hospital that he was entered into. Nothing. So what you have in Nietzsche is a sort of raving mania, but you do not have any of the physical markings that are evident in syphilitics. And Nietzsche lived far beyond what syphilitics normally would live for, so you would expect them. You would expect the nose to disappear. You would expect the face to be heavily marked. None of that happened. Now, as Nietzsche went on in the care of his mother, after he had been released from the mental hospitals that he had been in until 1889, once he'd been released from that into the care of his mother, and then into the care of his sister, once his sister took over from his mother, basically kicked her out in order to take complete control of Nietzsche's legacy in terms of royalties from his writings, which had suddenly taken off. As soon as he had become ill, his reputation just skyrocketed, almost immediately. Not because he was ill, but because suddenly people caught on to his work. So that initial stage of being taken care of is by his mother, then later by his sister, who may have kept him drugged to keep him quiet. We don't quite know. He was always on some sort of opiate to calm him down, get to sleep, etc., if he was in a manic state. But what his sister was doing at that point is not entirely clear, and certainly she's not going to acknowledge it or admit it. So in that stage, the later stage where Elizabeth, sister, was taking care of Nietzsche, well, what you get is him suddenly being subdued. And in that period, we know that he had 2 strokes. In fact, by the way, I must tell you that Elizabeth didn't accept the diagnosis of syphilis at all and insisted that in early 1889, with the horse episode, he had suffered a stroke at that point. That was her diagnosis of him then. So he then had 2 further strokes when he was in her care. And those strokes were really the final call for him, because after that he was really debilitated. He was suffering so much that he could not speak. He seems as though he could not think. He couldn't carry on a conversation, which he had been able to do earlier. He could sometimes come round and have a cogent conversation with people, but by that later stage, and say the last 5 years, that all went. So we have the stage when he was being looked after by his mother as an interim period of this final stage of his life, when he was not in such a bad state. He was raving, he was manic, he was inappropriate, he was many things, but he was not catatonic, as he may have been described as later. His demeanor at that early stage really was manic, and I want to suggest to you that one of the things that he could have been described as, instead of being described as having syphilis, which doesn't seem appropriate. His biographer, Ronald Hayman, says that there was no evidence of syphilis, and I'm inclined to agree. I think that's right. There was no evidence of syphilis, except from very vicious-minded people who wanted to pretend that what Nietzsche was saying, perhaps in Zarathustra, but certainly in the last year, was just raving lunacy, and that he couldn't be trusted on anything. One shouldn't read these works, because why bother? You're just reading the work of a raving syphilitic. That attitude, that mean-minded attitude, is completely undermined by actually reading the works. They're cogent, they're coherent, they're brilliant. But I suspect this attitude is encouraged early in the 20th century by outraged Christians who did not like at all what had been said in the Antichrist. I don't think it's all that vicious. I think the view that he has really is that Jesus was the last Christian, the only Christian that there was. There were no other Christians after Jesus. Jesus lived the life that he preached, so Nietzsche says, and that subsequently what you had was something which made little sense and was an attempt to capture that Christianity, that sort of godliness of the Jesus figure, and distill it in some way that one could live that life. But there were so many ways of prescribing that life from the Gospels that this ended up in a sort of a very diffused mess of a doctrine, which is what Nietzsche thinks of Christianity. Now, what were the alternatives to the diagnosis of syphilis, which was very, very thinly diagnosed and not subsequently reinforced by subsequent examinations at all? What were the alternative explanations? Well, here I'm going to follow a paper by Eva Cybulska, who is a consultant psychiatrist at an English hospital, and who published an article on Nietzsche's illness roughly in 2000, I think. And she says that, again, to repeat what I've said, there is no real reason for thinking that Nietzsche had syphilis, that syphilis was at the end of the 19th century being overdiagnosed by orders of magnitude, really, for anyone who had a sort of manic condition or a paralysis or a form of collapse was thought to be, well, that's syphilis. Because to repeat, there was no substantial diagnosis for syphilis. You could have almost no symptoms at all and be diagnosed, the physical symptoms that is, you could have no physical symptoms at all and be diagnosed with syphilis if you were unlucky, and then thrown into a mental hospital from which you couldn't really escape because it was assumed that this was a terminal condition. Now, Nietzsche was lucky. He didn't have that. He had family, and the family rescued him out of the mental hospitals after 2 years of being incarcerated through 1989 and 1990. And then he was released into his mother's care, as I said. Now, she wasn't a doctor, and she didn't have the ability to diagnose him, but she didn't seem to believe that he had syphilis either. So the alternative diagnosis that Eva Cybulska has put forward is that he had manic depression, and he had it through his entire life, and that this was an often found accompaniment to severe migraines, which he had and complained of all through his life. The manic depression was evident in the way that from the very beginning, he had all of these ailments, particularly when he was depressed, all of these illnesses, these sort of muscle cramps and all sorts of things, including the migraines, that would incapacitate him for weeks, months at a time. And then he would have high moments where he was relieved of the symptoms and which he would just sail off into a very elevated state. He had that even in Birth of Tragedy. So he would finish his works while he was in that elevated state, but he would make notes for these books when he was in a depressed state. And here we have something of the pattern of his life. In very elevated states, he would write grand things like Zarathustra, which wasn't, by the way, one single work. It was done in stages. Zarathustra Part 4 was done much later and was tacked on to the end of Zarathustra's Part 1 to 3, which were more coherent among themselves, and then Part 4 was a rhapsodic ending to the poem, to the work of Zarathustra, which Nietzsche, by the way, thought was one of the finest things he had ever written. I think many people don't read Part 4, but Nietzsche thought very, very highly of it and kept returning to many of the things in it in his later thoughts and writings. Now, in fact, he was tinkering with adding this into and out of the Zarathustra work right up to the end of 1888, writing to the printer saying that whether he wanted it or didn't want it included in Zarathustra. He wanted to take it out of Zarathustra, in fact, and save it for a time, 10 years' time, when the populace would appreciate it, because he didn't think they were going to get it at that moment. Well, glad that he didn't do that, because our current version of Zarathustra has Zarathustra Part 4 in it, and one can read it, but one probably shouldn't read it in quite the way that one had read, say, Part 1. It's not at all a simple following on from Part 1 or 2. So what we get then is Nietzsche writing these works, collapsing, but then sort of almost continuing on. 1888 could be regarded as a manic year. To write the amount that he wrote in that year, he wrote books within weeks. That's how fast he was. The last book he wrote was the Dithyrambs of Dionysus, where he had come to fully identify himself with Dionysus. He included the sexual encounter with Ariadne as a poem in that. It had already been included in Part 4 of, it is Part 4, of Zarathustra. He repeated it again. He clearly valued it over much of the rest of it. So there we have it. So what we have then is an alternative diagnosis by Cybulska, where this alternating pattern of depression and mania was moderately sort of a low amplitude, the depression and the mania, throughout most of Nietzsche's life. But in 1888, from the beginning of that year, the mania just goes up steadily and up and up and up, and Nietzsche is riding this wave up. He's writing 5 books. He is ecstatic through the entire time. This is the greatest time of his life, he says in Ecce Homo. This is his moment of triumph. Now, in his claims about this moment of triumph, he declares himself a god. And it seems as though the message that he intended to end the Antichrist was the extremely offensive view for Christians that God was dead, Christianity had to be destroyed, Nietzsche was going to be the new savior of mankind, the new Antichrist was going to be the new God. That God was to be Dionysus, the dancing god, the god of ecstasy, the god of sexual release. All of that was to be Dionysus. And by the way, I should say this, I should probably give a separate video on this, but Nietzsche's view of Dionysus is very close to the Greek view. It's not fantasy. There is a strain that runs through Greek mythology which is separate from the whole story of the Olympian gods. And it's the story of the genesis of Dionysus. And the culmination of that story is that at some point in the Greek history, prehistory, Zeus hands over the kingship of the world to Dionysus. And the Greeks, in the time of Plato and in the centuries around Plato, including the Pythagoreans, they were living in the time in which Dionysus was the king of the world. Plato, in at least one of his letters, I think it's letter 7, speaks of the king of the world, and people are left then to wonder who it is. It's almost certainly Dionysus. Orpheus is regarded as a saint in this, as a proselytizer for the god Dionysus, but Dionysus is the king of the world. go against Dionysus, tempt Dionysus, and you'll be struck down. That was the mythology. Euripides wrote a play, The Bacchae, on Dionysus, on the morning, I think before the play was to be performed in the stadia. I think it was for one of the competitions. He was torn to pieces by wild dogs. The fear of Dionysus, the reverence for Dionysus was very real in the Greek world. When Nietzsche takes on the position of Dionysus, he is taking on the position of the god who had been torn to pieces. That's part of the mythology. Early on, when he was a baby, the Dionysus was torn to pieces by the Titans and consumed. Nietzsche regards himself as having been torn to pieces. He's the dismembered god. He is the god of excess, but also the dismembered god, who will take Cosima von Wagner for his own. That was the sexual fantasy that dominated him. Note, he did not have any thoughts at that point for Lou Andreas Salome. None at all, it seems. His love, his enduring love, was with Cosima Wagner. So, there's that. So, when he goes on in this madness, and when he is taken over by it, at first, when he is in the care of his mother, he is given to shouts and screams at night. The household is disrupted. She has to move into a house which is quite large and a little bit isolated, so that there are not complaints from the neighbors that would summon the police to the house, which doesn't seem to have ever happened. So Nietzsche is able to scream and shout his heart out at night, and to be sort of unruly and to some extent without self-control in the daytime as well, but active, not passive, very active, but not capable of sustained thought, capable of perhaps, something, recognition perhaps, but nothing substantial, nothing long, wouldn't be capable, for example, of writing a book like the Antichrist. All that was gone. But it does seem as though the Antichrist haunted him, and that his idea that he was now God and had taken over the godly position, Godhead position, he returned to it over and over again, and not, it seems, in a very happy way. So maybe this sacrilege was something that was eating away at him, and I think that is very possibly the case. At any rate, the etiology of the disease, says Eva Cybulska, is compatible, much more compatible with a manic depressive state. And that it was very consistent with his migraines, and that it was something which did not have a proper diagnosis until after Nietzsche died, I think in the early 1900s. This was formulated as a proper diagnosis, but there wasn't any category for that. And that's possibly why many of the people who were diagnosed with syphilis, because it was a known thing, were given that diagnosis, because many of the other things were not clearly understood and had not been clearly named. There were no clear there was not a clear symptomology for these diseases. What was schizophrenia? It was something that was only understood in the 20th century, really. Manic depression was only understood in the 20th century. Paranoia, which went with the manic depression, was only understood in the 20th century. So this is something that seems to be much more characteristic of Nietzsche's disease, and he only became a really collapsed figure, a catatonic figure, a figure that didn't move, that didn't scream, didn't say anything, didn't shout out, wasn't asking for Cosima, all of these things. That seems to have been, in his early phase, a sort of this extraordinary wave that I said he was riding through 1888, this extraordinary manic phase. It was a very long manic phase, and it reached a peak sometime after the collapse. And he kept on in this manic stage for quite a while, until it was nothing other than an almost incoherent mania. And then it was followed by a very, very deep depression. So what he had come out of, what he had ridden this wave of bipolar, if you want to call it that, manic depression, this mania, which had allowed him to accomplish so much, that had to crash. And it did crash. And when it did, it sort of ended in a sort of an incoherent mania. And then that was a sort of degeneration of that state. And then it turned into this deeply depressive state of not being able to move, of sitting in a chair all day and then having to be sort of moved and tucked into bed at night. The very last sad stage in which he existed, and when really Elizabeth had taken over, and who didn't want him to be anything other than really a circus. She charged money so that people could come, acolytes of Nietzsche, could come and see the freak, the bedridden genius that she had upstairs. They would sort of get a peek behind a veiled curtain of Nietzsche and would leave in awe of what they had seen. This was really what Elizabeth Nietzsche was up to. Now, it was Elizabeth Nietzsche who organised the book, The Will to Power. This was not one of Nietzsche's books. It was a concoction, a monster, that was organised by Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche, who wanted to be able to pick things out of the notebooks, to gather what she wanted from the notebooks, to make this other work, this her own version of Nietzsche, The Will to Power. It was Elizabeth Nietzsche's will to power that exercised the interest of the Nazis later. It was not Nietzsche's own books, which was full of accusations of anti-Semitism against various people, his contemporaneous with him. It was Elizabeth's version of this. Nietzsche himself had no intention of writing a book called The Will to Power by the end. His intention was to write a book called The Re-Evaluation of All Values. And the first part of that he had actually written, which was The Antichrist. And then there were going to be 3 other parts to that. He never got to write those 3 parts. But this fantasy that the will to power is some sort of, the leading part of Nietzsche's doctrine goes along with this terrible, terrible mythology about his last years, which was that he was obsessed with the idea of will to power and that this was his crowning philosophy. It absolutely was not. It was barely even the idea for a book at one point, which was crossed out and then he moved on. The Re-Evaluation of All Values was his plan for his last book. That was it. The will to power, the belief in the will to power is all a mistake. And it's the mistake that we have gotten from Elizabeth Nietzsche. She sold that book essentially very deliberately. She had it compiled earlier than the Nazis, but when the Nazis came to power, she used that book to curry favour with the Nazis, that their rise was a will to power, that they had manifested in some strange way, will to power. By the way, Hitler himself was asked, whether he, by Leni Riefenstahl, who made Triumph of the Will, Hitler was asked by Leni Riefenstahl whether he had taken much from the works of Nietzsche, and he said no. He could not get into Nietzsche. He could not find anything to inspire him in Nietzsche. But many Nazis took The Will to Power as a Nietzschean book, the Nietzschean book par excellence. And the people who repeat the lie that Nietzsche had syphilis are often the ones who repeat the lie that his final book was The Will to Power, and the lie that he was encouraging or that he was himself an early Nazi. In some sense that goes together. These three things go together. Elizabeth Nietzsche was the organizer of the last two of those fantasies about Nietzsche. So that is it. The idea that Nietzsche had syphilis doesn't seem to be borne out by any medical records. If he had Nietzsche, it would certainly have been known by his mother and his sister, who were undressing him every night for bed and who had every opportunity to examine his genitals if they wished to. They certainly would have noticed if he had been missing a nose at some point. It doesn't seem to have been. So at the end of this, I'll put on the pictures from the records, the hospital records that I mentioned of what syphilis actually looks like. And it'll make it, I think, utterly clear that Nietzsche did not have syphilis and that he did not die of syphilis. If he did have syphilis, he would have died much sooner. And he would have died disfigured. And he was never disfigured. Except for his moustache, which was for some reason allowed to grow out by his sister, allowed to grow out into this immense bushy piece of nonsense over his face that many people think is characteristic of Nietzsche, and certainly wasn't while he was alive, while he was conscious, I should say, while he was compos mentis. This wasn't a feature of him. He didn't have this sort of overflowing moustache, this magisterial piece of bushwork over his lip that he did have later in life. If you ever see those photographs, which he has large bushy moustache, they're later photographs from when he was an invalid, a complete invalid. You probably wouldn't have known that he had the moustache at all. At any rate, that's it. Nietzsche did not die of syphilis. He probably was a manic depressive. He died probably from a sort of catatonic state that he'd been induced into by his strokes in the last years, and that these strokes had augmented a depressive period in his life, which had started quite a bit before the strokes. And that the mania was something which started roughly in December of maybe late November of 1888, and then continued on into early 1889 up to around August when his mother rescued him, and then to some extent continued on in this sort of almost a sort of free-form way without being much defined by anything except a sort of, this sort of yelling and abuse and a general unruliness, including a sexual unruliness. This was something which was much more consistent with syphilis. Most patients with syphilis, almost all patients with syphilis, do not have the sort of sustained creativity which Nietzsche was supposed to have had all through the time in which he was a syphilitic, apparently. There is no evidence for that at all. So none of the syphilitic story simply doesn't fit. And it was an overdiagnosed trait at the end of the 19th century which could never be properly confirmed. There was no test for it. It was simply an observational thing, and mostly the observational evidence was not in one's right mind. That was it. If a patient was not in his right mind, he might be just simply diagnosed with syphilis and then discarded into the mental hospital system. That was it. So that is it. I hope I've convinced at least one or two of you that this is all not just a lie, but a travesty, a way of slandering Nietzsche and his writings and not taking them seriously, but instead pretending that Nietzsche was, in his anti-Christian phase, was not in his right mind. I think he was in his right mind. I think he was perfectly cogent. That he had a dislike for Christianity is no evidence that he was insane. None whatsoever. But someone is perfectly entitled to a very sane opinion on that. And I think Nietzsche had that. I'm sorry if that offends people, but that was Nietzsche's view, and I think it's a reasonable view to have. Many people are not Christians. One has to just simply acknowledge that. Okay. So, I hope that convinces some of you, and I will continue at some future point, hopefully not too long from now. But I leave you now. Happy Christmas, Merry New Year. It was, we're, as I say, within a week, as of today, of Nietzsche embracing a horse only to collapse in the street.